is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Amid sentiments of anxiety, mistrust, and frustration, mixed in with a dash of humanity's eternal hope for the future, the recently concluded COP26 was regarded by many as the make-or-break global summit on climate change. It could set the right course to steer us into a bright and sustainable future, or signal the failure to deliver on the 2015 Paris Agreement's goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which is a benchmark for avoiding the most catastrophic climate disasters. For Africa, the continent that's already bearing the most severe consequences of climate change, the stakes are high and the sense of urgency is immense. Did COP26 map out a viable path forward for Africa? And what are the remaining issues, and can they be addressed in time to avert climate catastrophe? On this week's show, we're joined by an esteemed panel of experts to decipher the implications of COP26 on the continent. I am Liu Feifei. Welcome to Talk Africa. During the opening of COP26, some 25 African leaders took center stage to demand climate justice and greater support from richer nations. Let's take a look at what they had to say.
African heads of state have committed to prioritize actions that help the continent adapt to the impacts of climate change. Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta, while addressing delegates, said it's important for countries to embrace low carbon emission and develop resilience to control climate change.
What we need now is to recognize that we are in a race against time, and we need unanimity of purpose. We need boldness and unwavering political commitment to achieve the 1.5 degree pathway.
Science is clear that we only have a small window of opportunity to ensure that we collectively take decisive action and prevent the negative impact of climate change.
Malawian President Lazarus Chakwera urged nations to answer the calls of millions of Africans affected by the devastating effects of climate change.
We must answer them by establishing timelines for replacing all toxic technologies with clean ones. We must answer them through bilateral and multilateral relations that build green economies. And as you consider your answer, know that neither Africa in general nor Malawi in particular will take no for an answer.
On his part, the Liberian President George Weah called for a united global front in addressing the climate crisis.
Together, we can make a difference as a shared community of global citizens with a common destiny. Together, we can heal the world from the scourges of climate change. Together, we can save this earth from the deadly consequences of global warming.
The 2021 UN Climate Change Conference is a crucial moment for efforts to address the climate crisis. World leaders are expected to come up with key resolutions to keep the rise in the global average temperature to below 2 degrees. Daniel Arap Moi, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Let's now bring in our panel of experts to help us unpack the implications of COP26. Joining us in Johannesburg via Zoom, we have Tendile Chinyavanhu. She's a climate and energy expert at Greenpeace Africa. In London via Zoom, we have Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue. And in Lagos, we have John Ekoko, environmentalist and climate expert. A warm welcome to you all. Let's get right to it. After more than 2 weeks of intense high-level negotiations in Glasgow by nearly 200 countries, COP26 has finally come to an end. Isabel, let me start with you. What are the key outcomes?
Well, it's in some ways slightly underwhelming if you're expecting a resolution of the climate issue, because we didn't get that. But the progress, we did make progress. We didn't go backwards. So that's the first thing. So we agreed a climate pact in Glasgow, which accelerates the timetable for raising ambition, so that instead of coming back in 5 years with greater ambition, countries are now expected to come back in 1 year with greater ambition. And there was a big recognition that this decade up to 2030 is absolutely critical for mitigation in order to keep 1.5 alive, as the organizers put it. And that is extremely important, that recognition of the importance of 1.5. We've had a lot of science since Paris, and 1.5 is definitely now very much the target. So that was progress. Things that didn't happen, well, there were a lot of things were slightly kicked down the road, particularly on finance, but I think that they will come back pretty definitely for the next COP. There were a number of important side deals which are not technically inside the UNFCCC, but are also important. So a deal, many countries signed up to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. There was an important agreement to halt deforestation among many countries. And there were specific deals with, for example, South Africa, which has now got support for getting off coal. So, you know, slightly crab-wise, we are making progress. It was disappointing to a lot of people present, but I think that we need just to keep powering on, because we are making progress, not fast enough, but some progress nevertheless.
And you mentioned South Africa. Now, in terms of Africa, Africa was represented at COP26 by a group of designated African negotiators. Thandile, let me come to you. Can you give us a sense of who they are and the key issues that they brought to the table at COP26?
Well, I can give a perspective of civil society's delegates present. Some of the issues that civil society, specifically Greenpeace Africa and a number of the coalitions that we affiliated with, were present, and the issues that were top of our mind even before COP really began was the exclusionary nature of this COP, and how due to the circumstances of over this past few years with regards to COVID, that there were a number of factors that were keeping global South voices from being present at this COP. To name a few, the certain African countries being included on the red list despite having lower cases of COVID cases, as well as a number of issues with the prohibitively expensive cost of accommodation, failure to receive visas in time, and of course, vaccine inequity. So these are matters that we were campaigning on ahead of COP26, and were the reasons why we called for COP26 to be postponed. But as is the case, it went forward, and it was the role of civil society as well as climate strikers to ensure that the voices of the civil society and the global South were dominant at this COP and heard.
Thank you. Now, John, let me come to you to see if there's anything else that you want to add, because Thandile is talking about really the exclusionary nature of how some of the African participants were feeling there. What are your thoughts about some of the other negotiators and other issues that were brought to the table?
If you look at COP26, it is a damage control conference, because since Paris 2015, not much progress has been made with regard to the agreements at the COP in Paris. So right now, the idea is this climate inequality, to change it to inclusiveness. Yes, the expectations are clear, but the road to travel is not agreed by every participant. COP26 is a mixed bag. To some, it is a success. To others, it is a failure. To others, it is in between. At least for the very first time, fossil fuel and methane was brought to the negotiating table. Since Paris 2015, it had never been mentioned. That is the significant thing that, okay, fine. Even the carbon trading, there's an elementary agreement now. It never was there. So we can say there is some progress. But definitely, sub-Saharan Africa has gotten the short end of the stick. There's still a lot that needs to be done.
Okay, let me circle back to you, Isabel, on that. In terms of the African delegates, the negotiators that were there at COP26, what were some of the specific things that they brought to the table, issues that they wanted addressed at COP26?
Well, you know, African delegates, along with the other LDC delegates, they wanted clarity on climate finance. They wanted delivery of the long-promised $100 billion. They wanted more money for adaptation and not just mitigation. And they wanted progress on loss and damage. And that is compensation for the big emitters to the vulnerable countries. They were also looking for technical assistance and capacity building, as well as more ambition on mitigation from the bigger emitters. And these are all very important demands. As I say, you know, I can't say that many deals were signed in Glasgow, but I think that there was a much bigger recognition from the richer countries that adaptation was clearly important, that something has to be done on loss and damage, although the US and the EU both vetoed the setting up, or at least didn't agree to the setting up of a special facility on loss and damage. And I think that will be revisited. These are all things that are going to be revisited. And there was a lot of discussion in Glasgow on the barriers to investment in vulnerable countries, in the, you know, high interest rates, risk factors, and all of those things, which mean that African countries find it difficult to access the capital that they need. Now, that's now a very live and active discussion, how to bring blended finance in, how to use public finance to leverage private investment and so on. And that, I think, is where we should look for big progress before next year.
Now, it's nice to make pledges and set targets, but it's really hard to make good on them, right? You mentioned earlier that back in 2009 at COP15 in Copenhagen, there was a pledge that was made to provide $100 billion a year by 2020 to poor countries to address climate adaptation and mitigation. Now, I want to ask, how much of the promised funds have actually been dispersed and made available? And has any significant amount of that money reached Africa?
Very good questions. The last figures that I have seen were for 2019. The 2020 figures are not available yet, and it was 79 billion, so nearly 80 billion. So it's getting there. The expectation is that the 2020 figures will come in again higher. It really isn't good that it's not at the 100 billion, but there is a real recognition that needs to happen, and I'm pretty sure it will happen. How much of it comes to Africa? The fund was originally for mitigation, and it is quite clear that quite a lot of it needs to go to adaptation, because since that time, the impacts of climate change have you know, they're really hitting everywhere, but obviously they're hitting countries in Africa a great deal. Globally, about 10% of climate finance goes to adaptation at present, and only 19% of that at present, on the most recent figures that I've seen, goes to Africa. So there's a big gap there in terms of adaptation need, and that's a widely recognized gap. So again, these very active conversations on finance will, we hope, begin to address these gaps.
Tendele, let me come to you on this question as well. And the question is really one of access to the financing that's being provided by the COP framework, right? I believe a lot of the funds, the financing comes through what's called the Green Climate Fund. And, you know, countries have to jump through quite a lot of hoops to be able to fully access these funds. And from what I understand, it's really hard for some African nations to get direct access. Could you shed some light on that for us?
Well, that is a major concern within the South African context, and maybe part of the reason why our government campaigned so heavily for access to funds. Earlier just a few months before COP, some climate envoys from the UK, USA, Germany, and France came to South Africa to negotiate this pledge that was ultimately passed. And the hopes for South Africa was that this would be an opportunity for us to really negotiate a way forward for us to be able to access these funds. And the challenge for us, of course, is that there are a lot of conditions tied to accessing these funds, specifically around Eskom, our state utility, which is in the process of negotiating climate debt swaps, which would allow for them to service their 402 billion rand debt in exchange for climate commitments. And this is something as civil society that we are heavily in support of, and we definitely need to see some massive decarbonization from our state utility, as it is our largest emitter and a great scourge to society with the amount of load shedding that we're experiencing as of late. And a transition to renewable energy could definitely offer that potential for energy security as a nation, and an opportunity for us to service that debt that is a great inconvenience to our country right now.
We have to take a break now, but we'll continue with this conversation in just a moment. Stay tuned.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. We are discussing the implications of COP26 on Africa, and still joining me in Johannesburg via Zoom, Tandile Chinyavanghu, climate and energy expert at Greenpeace Africa. In London via Zoom, Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue, and in Lagos, John Ekoko, environmentalist and climate expert. John, let me come back to you first. Now, before the break, we were talking about the $100 billion a year commitment from the prior COPs. Now at COP26, African negotiators actually wanted financing for climate mitigation and adaptations to be scaled up to $1.3 trillion per year. What I want to ask you is, John, is this a reasonable demand? And is there any chance it will happen?
The $100 billion was a condition for Africa and the developing countries to actually mitigate the effect of the climate change, the adaptation itself to this green energy. In other words, the economies are not strong in themselves to undertake the investment required to move away from fossil fuel to green energy. So this was like a support fund. Very sadly, as at 2020, it had not been released. And even as at COP26, there's no clear commitment. But looking at what it will take, the issue is that the requirements are much more than the $100 billion by now. The developed world has committed a large amount of funds. And these are funds because they have institutions that are strong and they have cheaper cost. They can actually access these funds to mitigate the climate impact. But here in Africa, if you don't get either relief, you don't get maybe debt forgiveness or trade deals, you can't raise the fund. Our capital market is not so efficient. It's quite costly. And for us to be able to actually mitigate the effects of the climate change and to be able to adapt, we need to get support funds from the developed world. It was an agreement in Paris. Without it, they will not be able to proceed. That one is clear. So it's not a question of is it a sentimental request? No, it is part of the agreement in Paris 2015. So if they want us to move along with them, then I think they should prioritize it, just the way they prioritize the spending on the COVID pandemic. And the $10 trillion was about 30%.
Fair enough. Isabel, I'd love to get your perspective on this.
Right.
$1.3 trillion a year as of 2030. Now, we could even get the 100 billion commitment a year to actualize. Do you think this is feasible and realistic?
Well, it depends how much we join up our thinking. According to the International Monetary Fund, globally, we subsidize fossil fuel to the tune of $5.9 trillion a year. Why are we doing this? But if you look at what happened at COP26, it's very difficult to get everybody to agree to ending those fossil fuel subsidies. And it's not just the rich countries that are objecting. A lot of the developing economies also object to ending subsidies for fossil fuels. Would it not be better to put that 5.9 trillion into the needs of countries in Africa and elsewhere, into building resilient and renewable energy systems, and helping countries with adaptation as well as mitigation? Surely, rather than funding the problem, we should be funding the solution.
Indeed, well said. Now, Tendele, let me come to you for this next question. There's the concept of polluters must pay. And this extends to not really just countries, but big multilateral corporations as well. And I know Greenpeace works with a lot of corporations. Now, the Paris Agreement tried to address this, but to date, no mechanism has been put to place or has been developed to hold these people and companies and countries that are responsible truly accountable. Why is this the case?
As the issue with these COP26 discussions is that there is a lot of resistance from our leaders, and perhaps it may be their interests in fossil fuels and that desire to keep that industry alive. In South Africa, we face a lot of the same issues, and it seems that largely it's dependent on individual countries to have the policy mechanisms in place on their own, as opposed to having a policy that can be applied worldwide with regards to moving away from supporting these fossil fuel majors and allowing them to continue to pollute unabated. A carbon tax, a border tax, is something that was just discussed at the G20 event or G7 event earlier this year, and it's something that definitely needs to be applied to allow for these multilateral companies to be able to be held accountable for the pollution that they're responsible for. But as Isabel mentions, and I definitely need to agree, that these subsidies continue to prop up these companies, as well as in the case of South Africa with one of our major carbon majors, Sasol, they continue to receive these subsidies. And on top of that, our carbon tax mechanisms are so weak that they are able to evade paying these taxes to almost the tune of 8 million. So this is something that's definitely a major issue. And we want to see a lot more efforts from our governments worldwide to implementing a carbon tax that can be implemented at borders as well, and allow for, in the transportation of these fossil fuel products, for these companies to be forced to pay for the pollution that they're responsible for.
I have time for just one last question, and I'd like to ask this to each one of you, starting with Tendele. From an African perspective, was COP26 a success or was it a failure? And going forward, what needs to happen right now in order for Africa to avert climate catastrophes?
It was certainly a disappointment. I think as civil society, we expected a lot more action from our government and expected them to recognize the urgency of the situation. And unfortunately, they chose to have an incremental approach to climate change as opposed to the immediate action that is necessary. So COP26 was definitely a failure. We recognize the improvements that have been made, but definitely not the level of ambition that we needed. And going forward, what we need our government to do is to come back with nationally determined contributions that are a lot more robust and ambitious than what they put forward. Greenpeace Africa also conducted a piece of research that revealed that under a 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario, we're likely to see job creation to the tune of 45 billion jobs globally, whereas under a 5 degrees Celsius scenario, we will only see 30 million jobs. And this research was further affirmed this week by the University of Cape Town that revealed a study that revealed that if our government continues to pursue the 2,500 megawatts of coal-fired power that has been set aside in our integrated resource plan, that we stand to lose 25,000 jobs. So what we want to see is our government recognize that renewable energy is a lot cheaper and provides our country with a better economic prospects as well as socioeconomic prospects, and that they need to recognize this and put forward more ambitious NDCs and commitments.
Thank you. Isabel, your thoughts on success or failure and what needs to happen now?
Well, I think the formula, there was no great breakthrough, but it didn't break down either. We live to fight another day. And I absolutely agree with Thandile that I think the recognition of the opportunities that on the other side of this, there really is a better way of doing things. I think that's incredibly important. There are enormous opportunities here, as you know, China has known for a long time. And so these need to be spread around. On the positive side, as I said, I think that recognition of the urgency, the recognition of the critical decade up to 2030, and the increased expectation that countries that did not bring anything new to the table this time around will be strongly expected to align their nationally determined contributions to 1.5, and that pressure will continue. I think the sense that this crisis is upon us and we can't afford any delay. We will be looking in the course of the next year up till the next COP for concrete measures to be put in place on all the things we've discussed, including the finance arrangements, but also much greater ambition. After all, this is caused by emitting greenhouse gases. We really need to get the mitigation efforts up to speed at this point. We have no more time to waste.
Thank you for that. John, over to you for your final thoughts.
The developed countries, some of them have been championing the campaign not to fund fossil fuel energy. But the issue is that most of these sub-African countries actually make a lot of money from, either oil or gas. And these are monies needed to fund critical infrastructure. Let the reduction be gradual so that they can be raising funds from the resources they have. Yes, the 1.5 matters a lot. The greenhouse gas, the methane, the concentration, all that matters a lot. But these economies must survive.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. And with that, we are out of time. I'd like to leave you with the COP26 closing remarks of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He said, "I know you are disappointed, but the path of progress is not always a straight line. Sometimes there are detours, sometimes there are ditches, but I know we can get there. We're in the fight of our lives, and this fight must be won. Never give up, never retreat, keep pushing forward." A big thank you to our guests in Johannesburg, Thandile Chinyavanhu, climate and energy expert at Greenpeace Africa; in London, Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue; and in Lagos, John Ekoko, environmentalist and climate expert. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on your YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more of Talk Africa from me, Liu Feifei, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, goodbye.